I beg you to try it, Patricio.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricio. You were there once in your life.
Hey, people. Trish Wood here. And today we have a wonderful guest. It's Jeffrey Tucker from the Brownstone Institute. And we're going to do a bit of a mop-up on a whole bunch of COVID-19 issues, including their new initiative that is going to be the roadmap for holding people accountable for the biggest public health screw up, I think, ever in history. That's how I feel about it. I think it's true. Show me another one that's as big as this one has been. So stick around for Jeffrey. He's a friend of the show. He's been on quite a few times. And his writing and thinking about what's happened to us in the last couple of years always kind of puts me back on track. I feel like I'm not so alone when I talk to Jeffrey. We don't agree on everything, but you don't have to agree with everybody on everything. They want us to, but we don't have to be that way. It's not a tribe. And I want to talk to you a little bit in opening today about something I will discuss with Jeff, and that's the ongoing vaccine mandates in my country of Canada. What a joke. I don't even know where to begin. I will just say this, that recently our Prime Minister, with the complicity of the New Democratic Party, he's a Liberal, and maybe some Conservatives, I don't know how many, voted to continue the vaccine mandates that keep me and others like me, meaning people who are unvaccinated, from getting on an airplane or a train in this country or going in and out of the country. There is absolutely no medical or scientific basis for them going on with these mandates. None. And you know what? They're so arrogant that they don't even try to explain it. They don't. So that to me is a very, very bad result of what's happened with COVID in the last couple of years. It has given our elected politicians a sense of absolute powerfulness. They're not answerable to the opposition. They're not answerable to science. This feels punitive to me, people. It really does. It feels punitive. And let me tell you what my own personal stake in it. I have never actually said on the show before in those clear terms that I'm unvaccinated myself. And the reason that I didn't is because I feel that that is personal for people. You shouldn't have to answer those questions nor declare what you are or you aren't, right? That's how we've lived our whole lives in this country. But now I'm saying it. I'm unvaccinated. And the reason I'm saying it is because this new vote on keeping the mandates in place will prevent me from going to my son's graduation from university on Friday. After 5 years of school, honor student, honors degree. And let me say that he's a remarkable guy, because his first year of school, he got mono. So that was kind of a disaster. He was really sick. But he was such a good student that it didn't even impact his marks or his credits at all. Then I think another year went by, maybe or two, but then COVID hit, and he spent 2 years at a school where they were learning. He's a school. It's a university in another city. I won't say which one, but at a university that first demanded that healthy young people get vaccinated in order to attend, and then locked them out of the school. They did remote learning. So he spent 2 years, I think the first of the remote learning in a residence on campus, and then living in a basement apartment that he chose when the lockdowns the remote learning had been lifted for a minute, got this apartment, really cute basement apartment, living there alone, and then they locked them down, or not locked them down, but did remote learning again, right? So that's where he's been all school year. How do you get relationships with your profs? How do you learn and bond with your professors when it's all done remotely? Explain that to me. And why was it done remotely when the school demanded that they all get vaccinated? And especially now that we know that the vaccines aren't preventing transmission, number one, and number two, kids his age and his health aren't going to get sick and die of COVID anyway, right? So he's had a very, very atypical experience at university. Not the most fun. The sports, he's a basketball player. The sports were called down because of COVID, the socializing. No, you can't do that. I mean, it was just terrible for not just my son, but all kids who had to live through this time at university. So now he's graduating. So proud of him. And I can't go. So people listening might say, well, why didn't you just get a vaccine? Then you could go. That's not how this is supposed to work. I just had COVID, for one thing, and I'm in absolutely no possible danger of passing on COVID. I don't have it anymore, and I have antibodies too. I'm being kept off that plane that would take me to watch my son graduate because our prime minister and the opposition parties that support him are punishing me for not being obedient. That's what this is about. They cannot make a medical argument for keeping me off that plane. They can't. And you know what? They don't even try. They don't even try because they know they can't do it. And Canada just sits around cheering for this dude, right? Like, well, people are starting to be really mad about it. But the fact that he can still get away with it is absolutely shocking to me. So I want to play you. So let me just say this. So I'm very, very upset about it. My older boy is going in my place. So that's good. And I'm proud of them both and they'll have a wonderful time, but I would like to have been there too. I'm sticking to my guns because I'm sticking to my guns. I know my boy supports me. He had a real eye-opening when he started reading he's in a sciences program when he started reading some of the literature. So he supports mom, even though I'm being stubborn. And even though it means I won't be there, but his brother's going. So that's wonderful. But I just want to play this clip for you of Theresa Tam, who is the sort of head of Public Health Canada, explaining that there's never been a documented case that she can think of COVID being transmitted on a plane. Here's the clip.
What does the research tell us now about the risk for air passengers contracting COVID-19 on commercial flights?
Yeah, so there's been very few reports, extremely rare reports actually, of transmission aboard aircrafts. And I think we are learning more and more about some of the technologies, if you like, in terms of the ventilation and the way that aircraft ventilations work is actually, the modern aircraft is actually really good in terms of air exchanges and the way that the airflow occurs in the cabin. So there has been a few reports, but actually very, very little. I think we continue to ask provinces to report to us if you've seen reports to actual positive passengers, but have not demonstrated an actual transmission on board the aircraft itself. We have not received that kind of report. But the other thing is that in that setting, there are ways in which you could put in procedures like mask wearing. People are sitting facing the same direction with seat backs, in front of them. So there are a number of reasons, perhaps, as to why we are actually not seeing the actual conveyance itself as being a main area or setting of spread.
So I don't know if you actually took on board or were able to take on board what she was saying there, but what she was saying is that no, it doesn't seem to be a problem, but we're going ahead with it anyway. I mean, right? Like where is our prime minister getting the evidence that going on with the vaccine mandates is scientifically justified? Not from her, if she's telling him that, right? So the other thing that this really exposes for me too is the failure of Parliament to rein this in. There are wonderful MPs doing the very hard job of trying to kind of put this on the agenda. One of them is Melissa Lantsman, who says in the House exactly what I'm saying now, but they never respond. They do some big, we're protecting Canadians and we're, in the abundance of caution, but they never deliver the goods. They never deliver the science to back up because they can't, right? So here is Melissa Lantsman.
Conservatives have been asking this government to release the metrics and the science they've been using to justify the travel restrictions and mandates. Last week, no one in this House could produce any. Today, at committee, the Transport Minister finally admitted that he has specific advice that led to the decisions to keep the random testing of 4,000 passengers a day and the mandates for domestic travel in place. If he has it, why is it a secret? And will he tell everyone in this House what his colleagues were unable to tell us last week?
Right, and so they don't answer the question because there is no science at all that backs up what they are doing. Even Bill Gates has admitted, and I think Anthony Bourla has too now, that the vaccines are not very good at preventing transmission. They're failing. So yeah, they're going to keep me off that plane. And I'm not the only one, by the way. It might sound selfish, but there are many, many people in the same boat that I am in who have reasons for wanting to travel, to see an ailing loved one or whatever, and they can't do it. And to those saying, well, just get a vaccine, man, that is extortion, isn't it? That is extortion. You can't see a relative or a dying relative because you don't have a vaccine because the government says so, even when the vaccine is no longer serving that purpose. Yeah, that's not a good look for this country. And I will say it, Prime Minister Trudeau and his bromance with Jagmeet Singh, who helped him push this through, ought to be ashamed of themselves. And so should the media, who aren't. There are some pretty good editorials about it, but they just ignore them and keep on going, right? They don't care. And that's a very, very sad thing to have to come to terms with, that there's no justification for something and they're doing it anyway. This is a parliament gone rogue, people. So I want to just kind of follow up a bit on our last two shows. In both of them, we were talking about the school shootings, both in Buffalo, New York, and in Uvalde, Texas, which I'm still reeling from. And last week we talked about how the two boys were clearly struggling mentally and how lockdowns and school closures may have played a role in exacerbating their problems. I'm convinced that they did. And in fact, Peyton Gendron from the Buffalo shooting says so. He's not making excuses. He just talks in a way about the lockdowns that you can tell he's said, I went down to my basement to hide out, that something's terribly, terribly wrong there. The other thing we talked about is the idea that the teachers' unions were very much responsible for making sure that there were lockdowns and keeping them going once they happened. And I was very surprised by that because I tend to love teachers and used to see them as heroic. Certainly the teachers in Uvalde, Texas were heroic. I understand that, but they weren't very heroic around COVID because the children in the schools had virtually no chance of dying from COVID unless they have other comorbidities. It's just not the demographic. That's what the science said. And if the teachers were worried for their own health, then they should have kept the schools in and brought in substitute teachers who weren't at risk for a bad COVID outcome. But instead of doing that, to protect their jobs, they shut down the schools, which have destroyed a generation of children. I'll just say it. So now we've seen the two shootings. Now what else is coming in? So one of the things that I read a couple of days ago is that teachers in Texas, who, by the way, I read their guidelines for opening schools, and they were absolutely onerous and almost impossible to meet. They are now apparently leaving the profession. Guess why? Because kids are so crazy from lockdowns and school closures that they've become a threat and a massive discipline problem for the very teachers who insisted that the schools be closed. right? They created a problem, and the government let them create the problem. And now they're leaving because of the problem. The other thing that has happened in this world of all of these professions, including teachers, wanting to focus so much on the disadvantaged, the closure of the schools was a disaster for kids who come from non-wealthy families, who are struggling, right? This just came in a report a couple days ago that landed on my desk. One of the most alarming findings is that school closures widen both economic and racial inequality in learning. In Monday's newsletter, I told you about how much progress K-12 education had made in the U.S. during the 1990s and the early 2000s. Math and reading skills improved, especially for Black and Latino students. This is American. The COVID closures have reversed much of that progress, at least for now. Low-income students, as well as Black and Latino students, fell further behind over the past 2 years relative to students who are high-income, white, or Asian. This will probably be the largest increase in educational inequity in a generation, Thomas Kane, an author of the Harvard study, told me. So the school closures cannot be justified. We are now seeing, as they say, the chickens are coming home to roost. And people must be held accountable for this. Randy Weingarten of the American Teachers Union, I've forgotten the exact name of it, who was on TV night after night as if she was a COVID expert demanding school closures, and is now lamenting the mental health crisis in the students. What a joke that is. This was all predictable. I keep saying that, but it was predictable. You will hear Jeffrey Tucker say in the interview today that that people like him and others have been talking about this for a very, very long time during the pandemic, and no one was listening. No one was listening. So now we are seeing the fruits of all of these policies that were put in place and left unchecked and unmitigated. People are going, "Oh, wow, this is a gun problem. This is this problem," and the shootings may be a gun problem, but they're also a lockdown school closure problem, no question. They told the kid, Peyton Gendron made that clear. So you have to wonder and shake your head at how we got here. Now seeing the fruits, people not mitigating, not actually even really caring about the damage that was being done. I mean, right? It's just, it's something that if you dwell on too much is pretty darn depressing. But we must never let it happen again. And I hope these school shootings calm down, but I don't have any reason to believe they will. They did arrest a kid, really young kid, who was making threats in the States the other day. A couple of events here too. So we have to come up with a remedy now. It's a mental health crisis, and we have to come up with a remedy. We can't hide. And they don't want to come up with a remedy because doing so will show where the fault lies for this. So they're just letting this roll out. It's not good. The other thing we talked about on the show last week was this terrible, terrible passivity on the part of the police in Uvalde, that they stayed outside. They went against what I believed were part of the human instinct and also the masculine instinct of these cops, that one rescues children even if there's a great risk to one's own health and safety. And when they're hired, they're told that. And so I got a lot of emails from various people on that subject. And I want to read one I got from a guy who's an EMS. He's very interesting. He says, "I'm listening to the last episode of Trish's podcast, and I haven't gotten through it, but I wanted to respond to the opening thoughts she had on the school shooting in Texas. Mostly, I want to respond to her maybe rhetorical question about why men don't run in to help children being murdered when they have the means to do so. I'm a mid-30s man working in a major metro EMS system in Canada. That's emergency. These are the paramedics. I'm not a cop, and nothing I have done compares to standing around while kids are massacred wholesale. But I have been in unusual, violent, and life-threatening situations during a 15-year career. There have been 3 distinct times I recall. They are among the very few events that stand out in my memory from my career, where I took initiative and personal risk and made a choice that was decisive in helping somebody and or protecting other people in an extreme situation. I want to emphasize this is 3 events in 15 years to underline I'm not an exceptional person, risk taker, or the type who seeks out these opportunities. In all 3 situations, I was told not to do it again, and that to do so was dangerous and to consider theoretical situations where it could have gone badly. After the COVID fiasco and the general effort to disenfranchise me by the wider public, I've decided to just follow those instructions. I'll never do it again. If it's not my family or friends in trouble, I'm at work to color inside the lines as dictated by human resources departments and lawyers. That's an interesting idea. During the opening, you asked about how men can be so passive and what has happened to men. I don't know if this sketchy anecdote from one burnt-out man provides a full answer, but hopefully it gives you at least an idea of what happened. We got told, mostly by women, to stop being men and to start being obedient, inoffensive flesh lumps addled by fear. I'm just holding up my end of the bargain, and I have no doubt those cops felt they were doing the same. So that's an interesting idea. I mean, I don't recall ever saying those things to a man, but I think men do feel put upon. Do I think that may have affected the cops who didn't go in to rescue those kids? Sure, it may have. But I also think we have to, again, look at the pandemic too, where we were trained to be obedient, where we were trained to go against our natural affinity to be kind and connect with each other, where police were arresting people in playgrounds on orders. And also, let me just give you a story. When the police were breaking up the trucker demo, I was on the phone with one of the people who was fairly high up the food chain there, talking about what he was seeing as the police lines kind of rolled through the lines of protesters. And here's what he said. He said, we had a really good relationship with the police, which I know they did. I've heard tapes confirming that. And they hoped and they believed that the police ending the demonstration, many of whom sided with the protesters, would actually put their shields down in protest and not follow orders, right? But they did. He said that they could see that some of the police in that situation were actually a bit weepy about what they were doing. So I don't know why the feeling about following orders is so strong right now. I suspect it's because of COVID and the insane restrictions we were obediently ordered to follow, even if they hurt other people and ourselves. I mean, kids in Canada one person was instructed to lock their COVID positive child in the bedroom for 12 days and leave the food outside the door. I mean, seriously. So if you can do that to a sick child, follow those orders, I guess you can follow orders not to rescue children who are being shot to death. That's just a part of it for me. I'm not saying it's the whole deal. I know there's been cultural pressure on men to be less masculine. I get it. And I understand what our listener is saying here. And I think it's very sad. And also that they're told, no, the lawyers won't let you do it. And that sort of, I know that's true. So here's where I do our pitch. I'm always very, very grateful to see commitments coming in over either PayPal or Patreon for us. We do need them to keep the lights on here. And I'm always super, super grateful and a little bit emotional sometimes too. And I love the notes you send. I'm still working on getting through them all, but I will. My website is trishwoodpodcast.com. woodreporting.com. My Twitter is @woodreporting. I have a YouTube channel we're going to be uploading some stuff to in the next couple of weeks as I heal more from the long COVID and get my energy back. And so you can go there and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's got some midweek meltdowns and coffee with the convoy videos up that are really fun to watch again. Weren't we hopeful, everybody? We were so hopeful. So do that. And send me an email if you like, info@trishwoodpodcast.com. I'm going to announce the winners of our book giveaway on next week's show because I haven't got to it yet. I'm sorry. But there will be a new supporter will get one, and somebody who's been around for a while with us will get one also. So please do consider that. And so here is my interview with Jeffrey Tucker. He is from the Brownstone Institute doing some of the best work ever in looking at what happened, where we are now, and where we should be going when we start reviewing, and I hope holding accountable the people who wrought this 2-year horror on us through ill thought out and I think punitive public health policy. So here's my conversation with Jeffrey. Hi, Jeffrey. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm glad to have you, actually, especially considering the events of the last couple of weeks. You wrote and I'm talking about the two 18-year-old teenagers involved in these two shootings, one obviously in Buffalo and one in Uvalde, Texas. In my view, both connected either directly or indirectly to school closures and lockdowns and the isolation and mental health problems that brings to children. You wrote a great piece about how we've lost our moral clarity invoking the Buffalo case. Can I get you to talk about that? I thought it was really smart.
Well, so much of our moral sense derives from our social interactions and the stability of the world, the predictability of the institutions, the liturgy of life, the things we learn from people we're around, the observations of other people's successful behavior and how we can emulate them, and we're gradually socialized in this way, and this is what Freud called the creation of civilization. You sublimate your id and replace it with your superego, the manners and mores that you comply with. And I think lockdowns really did represent a kind of decivilization process. We threw everybody into isolation, and it's inevitable that you're going to have some cohort of people in that to whom this happened are going to experience PTSD style symptoms, And the Buffalo case was in particular interesting because, if you read his manifesto, which I don't like this, but it was actually very difficult to find that manifesto. There's this impulse now to censor.
Yeah, I downloaded it the minute I saw it, the PDF. Yeah.
This all began in New Zealand some years ago when some freak wrote did something terrible, and then they imposed criminal penalties for having a copy of the manifesto.
Oh, really? So
this is happening more and more, but I think people should read it because it's a look into the pathology that this guy went down, and the ideological structure that he sort of embedded himself into as a classic sort of racist ideology, and he and you have to think about why did he go this direction? I mean, he says in his own manifesto that he was bored out of his mind. The tedium of life, wake up in the morning, nothing to do. You have to turn on your computer, and you just. So he started looking through 4chan, 8chan, 16chan, whatever it is, and finding this sort of taboo subjects, about race and superior to the white race. And it's pretty interesting because here you have a guy who's been robbed of his normal community,
yeah,
and so he then fantasizes about his new community, which is organized around the principle of race. And if you don't have a check, you don't have parents around saying that's dumb, other kids around showing a different way, you just kind of keep getting more and more embedded into this crazy ideological structure. He's 18 years old. He was probably missed school for at least a year, maybe as long as a year and a half, maybe longer. We don't actually know.
Well, it was New York State, so I'm assuming their school closures were pretty elongated, right?
Right. And then you have, the whole track and trace thing. So if one kid in the class, gets exposed to cholera, and then they have to, get but it's a massive instability. So he follows this trajectory of insanity straight to this murderous path, and it loses all empathy and moral clarity.
Well, there was, sorry, I just wanted to say that there was something about him also, and this includes the Salvador Ramos in Uvalde. They were both already victims of a really cruel high school culture, right? They were both loners. They were both misfits. They were both picked on. And it really feels to me like you had these already vulnerable guys who were being kind of betrayed by a system that doesn't intervene with these kids. The guy, Peyton Gendron's mother had to call people and ask them to please hang around with her son because nobody wanted to be friends with him, right? So you take these already super vulnerable guys, the Uvalde shooter had a lisp and also had no friends. And so you take what I said last week was this. What the lockdowns and school closures did was they took kids who were not mentally ill and made them mentally ill.
Yeah.
And they took already mentally ill kids and made them worse, right? And that's who these two guys were. So to me, it's an indictment not just of what we did during those 2 years, but how many of these people are slipping through the cracks anyway. I mean, that was a revelation to me in watching these two stories play out. I was surprised at how completely unwell they both were.
But one thing that shocked me in the aftermath of Buffalo, and the same thing happened in the Texas thing, is I don't understand it. But I mean, apart from my article and then Paul Alexander's article, and you mentioned somebody on Discord who was pointing this out, I saw no mention of the school closures and the lockdowns.
Yeah.
In any of the commentary on what was motivating these kids. I mean, how can you ignore this? I mean, we shut the schools for 1 or 2 years, for these kids in the prime of their high school years. And why is that not a relevant consideration? I don't understand. Is it a taboo to bring it up? Is it that it's so traumatic that people don't want to talk about it? That people just somehow forgot about it? I don't really understand it, but I don't see how you can even discuss the pathology of the youth today without reference to the lockdowns.
I think it's absolutely obvious. But, we had Paul on last week talking about this because of the piece he wrote for you, which was terrific. And he told a story that was pretty hair-raising. He said, when I was advising President Trump, we didn't want to keep the schools closed. We were desperate to get them open. We went to the media and said, please start publicizing that there's going to be problems here. He was beside himself. He gave us a kind of a soliloquy of pain on this last week about how frustrated he was that the media wouldn't take up this cause. And here's what I think, cynical me. I think that the media would not talk about school closure and lockdown harms because they fully supported the lockdown school closure narrative.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It's probably a combination, but that's one. They're backing all this stuff, and of course, if you back the policies that lead to such tremendous psychological damage on the part of a whole generation, you just don't really want to talk about it.
No,
but these kids, this didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened for a reason, and it's just strangely appalling. I was on a radio show soon after all this stuff, and it was on a different topic, and I just mentioned this in passing, and the hosts were shocked. I mean, they were stunned into silence. They just couldn't believe it. And they said, "Are you saying that the school closures had something to do with the creation of the encouragement of these kind of violent acts?" And
it's flabbergasting.
Yeah, and they weren't. They weren't mad at me for bringing it up. They just had never thought about it,
But this is what we're going through now. See, this is why I am doing yet a third show on the school shootings, because people warned for 2 years that if this kept on going, we were going to fundamentally change society in a really bad way. And my response to the people who aren't getting it is, what did you think it would look like? What do you think severe mental illness in a generation of teenage boys looks like? There are always going to be guys who were made worse, these outliers that are made worse, that are made sicker and sicker and sicker. Well, it's like nobody actually contemplated what the kind of actual outcome of a traumatized and downtrodden nation and its children would be. So yeah, they're surprised when somebody links the school shooting. I would say it's totally that reason, but it's certainly, you can connect the dots to it. And I'm shocked that they're shocked, actually. I think Peyton Gendron said so in his, in his writings,
Yeah, it's amazing that there's such a taboo around this topic, and so I'm glad you're talking about it. But the harms are immense, and it doesn't mean that every person who's got locked out of school, turns into a mass murderer. But it does mean that there's just on the margin a degradation of the moral sense, a loss of kind of a centered life, and you lose your community. I mean, you can't live like that. I mean, we asked 16, 17, or 18-year-old kids to sit in their rooms for 2 years. It's just, it's cruel and crazy. And we did it in the name of mitigating a virus. It all came out of the models, that we couldn't social distance in schools. So we had to close them. That was what they believed. It was intellectuals pushing their crazy virus control agenda without regard to issues of humane treatment of the youth, of the development of the human personality, the need for social contact, for the socialization, of normalcy, to say nothing of learning, right? The policy was just unbearably cruel.
I completely agree. I think cruelty is the kind of main event in what's happened in the last 2 years. I'm actually doing a book about it. I'm using stories from the show and getting new ones of people who suffered something that might even be kind of described as torture. I said this on the show a couple of weeks ago, that there's a law, I think it came from the Supreme Court in America, about solitary confinement, where you can only do it for 10 days or something. Otherwise, it falls under some torture statute. But we were locking people away alone in long-term care, both there and here in Canada, for weeks, for months, right? So it's the same circumstance as things that we as a society hate and don't agree with, but yet when they're done under the rubric of COVID, it's like anything is possible. Morality is turned upside down. The same thing we do to a prisoner, we say is bad. We do to our grandmother, we say, well, if it saves one life, right? I mean, it's a crazy, crazy paradigm that has done a lot of damage to us, I think.
And the New York Times almost every day now is running not every day, but every few days running a big story on mental health crisis among young people, or the health crisis, or this crisis or that crisis, and they always blame the pandemic. And it drives me crazy because viruses don't do this. Lockdown policies do, and so we have to pretend as if this is just pandemic comes along. This is what happens. No, it doesn't happen. We chose these policies.
As if the virus itself did this, right? It's nothing to do with the virus. It has to do with our response to the virus, right?
Well, that's the thing, but they don't say that, and all you have to do is add pandemic response to every sentence, and it makes it clear. But they don't want to do that, and I think what you said is right. It's because they supported all these policies.
Yeah, they won't. They're absolutely complicit in the disaster we're going through now, and I have no faith that they'll ever do a mea culpa, or it'll be on the back page and they won't change. they won't change how they approach this anyway. You know, it's still the approved narrative of the day. And if the approved narrative favors the people in power that they like, then that's how they report it out, you know?
It's the approved narrative, and there's every intention to repeat this the next time around. I mean, I've not seen any evidence that there's any sort of mea culpas going on. We're never going to do that again. Quite the opposite. The World Health Organization is trying to codify lockdowns as part of its pandemic response. The Biden administration, you know, is furious at this Florida judge for having ruled against the CDC's power and trying to get it all back. They still believe in lockdowns. They still believe in them. And the only reason not doing it right now is because they think, I mean, there would probably be a revolution. People are sick of it, you know?
Yeah.
So there's that, but the next disease panic is going to start all over again. I don't see any stepping back from these policies.
I feel like they've learned nothing. But I also feel if you really examine the kind of what we call elites, that's the wrong word, but the educated bureaucracy class or whatever, that they sit around patting themselves on the back. If you look how they talk to each other about their COVID policy, they'll say, what a great, you were so great. Your vaccine program was so successful, but they don't define what success is. Vaccines are failing like mad, but it's not about the success of health. It's about how many they were able to get people to take. That's they keep kind of shifting what success looks like so they don't have to admit how they screwed up.
Yeah, it's so true. And the vaccines were, of course, the great, devastating disappointment of the last 2 years. It would have been very different if these things had been sterilizing, and had actually protected people as they promised from COVID. But everybody knows it didn't happen. Everybody got sick anyway. And you can do these pious incantations that I'm so grateful to be vaxxed and boosted because it would have been much worse. But you don't know that. You don't know. Maybe the vaccine itself is creating, vax. It's ruining people's immune systems. Could be exactly the opposite. We don't know this, but I don't know. The whole vaccine thing has become a tremendous scandal. I mean, we know it doesn't stop infection. We know it doesn't stop spread, and we're still waiting on data whether or not and to what extent they reduce overall mortality among the elderly population that's vulnerable. We don't fully know that yet, and then of course we're getting ever more indications of adverse effects, and I don't know. It's a scandal, and I've been thinking more about these mandates. It's one thing to offer a product out there and say, if you want the vaccine, get it. And well, I'll get it or I'm not, whatever. But to force people to consume a product, it's an incredible thing to have done, all in the name of public health. There's no public health rationale for these mandates. If they don't stop transmission, they don't stop infection, they don't contribute to herd immunity, which is to say they don't have any public purpose. None. They might have a private purpose, but no public purpose.
I know it's mind-boggling, especially being in Canada, right? We have this these crazy mandates about travel, and the one that they were just renewed a couple of days ago by this new prime minister and a parliament that's absolutely failing as a democracy. And when the opposition party members question them during the debate about what evidence they can bring that the mandates that keep people like me from flying, right? I cannot get on a plane still I can't get on a train in my own country. I can't travel, right? What is the evidence to back up the reasoning behind that? They don't have it and they won't provide it. And yet the people in the new Democratic Party and the governing Liberal Party voted for them. It wasn't even close. It's like, wow. What has taken over? My wonderful youngest son is 22 and graduating with honors after 5 years of university in another city where he spent most of the time alone in his basement apartment doing remote learning, fully vaxxed, which they demanded, and then went to remote learning, right? And he told me terrible stories about what he was seeing psychologically in the kids there. So, but I can't even go and celebrate this triumph of his. I cannot go. And maybe some would say, go and get a vaccine, but he fully supports now my pig-headedness on this. I'm just not going to do it. Mm-hmm. And I had a nasty bout of COVID and I got a nasty bout of long COVID now. And I don't regret for 1 minute not getting that vaccine. I won't be browbeaten into something that they have not provided strong scientific evidence for. Full stop. I just won't. Right.
Well,
So
getting the infection is better than a vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a basic principle of immunology that we've known for 100 years. And Fauci's made that point again and again. And we knew this from the very outset, that if COVID was not, if you didn't experience a mortality risk with COVID, you're better off getting exposed than you are, just hoping that the vaccine will protect you. But that's even if it were a good vaccine, but it's not a good vaccine. So you're going to get it anyway, And so you definitely did the right thing. The immunities you get from exposure are vastly better. And we've known this for I was going to say 2 years, but we've actually known it for 100 years for this type of virus,
Yeah. So that's what's happening here. And I want to hear from you, your take on it, because it's so insane. Like there's no basis for it. Right. And we had our big trucker event, which I'm very open about having supported. I didn't get my bank account snitched because I didn't give them any money, but they did snitch bank accounts from people who did.
Yeah.
Awfully. How awful. But there, there's no pushback. People aren't saying, wow, there's the occasional column about, oh, we really should, get rid of these things. But our prime minister doesn't even have to, he doesn't do us the courtesy of even explaining what the validity is. Well, obviously he can't because it's not preventing transmission, right? But it feels punitive to me, right? It feels punitive. We're not being obedient.
We live in an age of mysticism, where we could have these draconian policies all over the place, and they don't even feel the need to explain them at all. And in fact, they get offended by asking for explanations. Well, that's not. We don't have to give you an explanation. Just comply. That's it. I don't know. It's really grotesque. It's like what we imagine the Middle Ages to be. Where the doctrine overrides the science, and they have invented all these doctrines. And it's all about pretending as if they did the right thing. They're never going to roll back. They're never going to admit error. For some reason, the virus response became a political signal, and it's mostly on the left, unfortunately, not entirely, but mostly, that the more compliant you are, the more you symbolize your adherence to this one political tribe. It's the strangest thing that ever happened. So it's not even about the science. It's not about principles. It's just about tribal loyalties.
Yeah, that's tribal allegiance. Yeah, well, it's true.
So bizarre.
And it is bizarre. I've never seen anything like it. Not in my lifetime. Clearly, people are seeing things only through the lens of their own belief system and filtering out any information that contradicts that. That's just. It is a level, I will say, Jeffrey, it is a level of mental illness too, I think, within the population, generally speaking. They're not bad people, but you cannot have conversations still, at least in Toronto, with people who who hold different views on vaccines and mandates and that sort of thing. You just can't. The hostility is extraordinary.
Really intense, is it?
Yeah.
That's interesting. One of the things that's been fascinating about the unfolding of all this stuff is that most countries in the world have recovered from the mania a lot more quickly than Canada and the U.S. And I think even Australia is starting to kind of wise up. And I think in a few days we're getting rid of all vax mandates and all restrictions. And it's like, okay, we're gonna learn to live with COVID. They should have done that 2 years ago, but okay. But the U.S. is still requiring. And you're complaining about travel restrictions, which is outrageous in Canada. Happy, free Canada, right?
Yeah.
The U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that to get in, you have to test negative for COVID to get into the U.S. Even if you're an American citizen, you have to arrange a COVID test before you get in.
It's insane.
And this all this stuff is based on, this. It's all based on this idea that we're going to control the spread. And so I can't, that we're going to slow the spread. Why you should slow the spread was never clear to me. But, the idea that you're going to contain the virus It's just so self-evidently ridiculous at this point. Everybody's going to get COVID. Like, why would you go through all these things? You know, we don't want COVID in our country. I mean, this has been 30 months now of this nonsense that we've been restricting. Like, our clean country doesn't want bad COVID in here, so you have to take a test. I mean, meanwhile, you know, we've got probably 60% seroprevalence in this country, which is not even a measure of immunities conferred by vaccination. That's a measure of the number of people who have been contracted the virus and gotten over it. You know, that's what seroprevalence measures. So we have something like 75% of kids and 60% of the overall population. And that's from an MMWR study that came out from the CDC. So, you know, the whole effort to contain this virus was an immense flop. And yet we keep doing it. I mean, even now, there's all kinds of companies that have policies in place that if you're exposed to the virus, you can't come to work. I mean, give me a break. You know, we're still pretending to do this track and trace, contain the virus stuff after 30 months. It's just, I mean, it's a measure of how insane public life can become once you accept, as a matter of doctrine, you know, something that's basically a myth, and then you can't somehow reverse it. You know, if I had known that, you know, 30 months later we'd still be doing this, you know, March 2020, I just would have been shocked. I thought that humanity had just in general a better capacity for responding to evidence, for changing course when things weren't working. So it's been a shock to me, really, just to observe I guess you would say, the network effect of error and how persistent it is.
Well, and I think what is driving that, Jeffrey, is the idea that people like Tony Fauci, for all his power, and Dr. Tam here in Canada, and you know, the people in the UK, the SAGE people, they're not saying it's over and we can relax. No one, you know, they never send out a message that things are getting better. They're either quiet or they're pushing more fear. And this is the other failure of public health, because it would seem logical, if you're concerned about the mental health of the citizenry, that not only do you warn them, but you tell them when the fire is out. And they're not doing that. They don't seem to want to do that. They don't seem to think that that's their role. And that I don't understand. I don't get why they are so committed always to the fear porn and to keeping it going as long as they can and keeping us nervous. That makes no sense to me from a public health standpoint.
Well, you know, it could be that if you're responsible for generating an irrational public panic that basically destroyed civilization as we know it,
yes,
that you're concerned that people are going to wake up one day from this nonsense and be furious at you, you know? So probably their best hope for avoiding accountability is to keep people in a constant state of frenzy. Yeah. That might be the whole explanation. I don't actually know. We know for sure that they whipped up disease panic in late February, starting February 27th and extending all the way through the next 30 days, just to get people to acquiesce to lockdowns.
Yeah.
And it was such a bad policy with so many grim consequences. You know, we talked about education, but just the cultural consequences have just been, cultural and economic consequences have just been absolutely devastating. I think, I mean, there's a sense in which the lockdowns have changed us as people in ways that are indiscernible. One of the strangest economic trends we're seeing around right now is the labor shortage. So that's something we've never actually seen in our lifetimes, an actual shortage of labor. It's a very interesting thing because unemployment is very low, but labor participation is down to levels that it was nearly 40 years ago.
To what do you ascribe that, Jeffrey?
Well, so, you look at the data and you can find some small explanations for, you can find some gradient of explanations and things like, okay, when the schools are closed, moms had to monitor their kids at home. So they left their offices, and then they discovered that this thing was going on. So they quit their jobs and decided to become full-time moms at home. I mean, that among the cohort of people who have left the workforce, women with children is definitely the highest.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, you can look it up on Federal Reserve statistics in St. Louis that the dropouts among women with kids is immense. We're back to, in terms of women's participation, older, I should say, women in their 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
Their participation in the labor force is what it was 40 years ago right now. And I've not heard the feminists complaining about this. I mean, this is, getting women in the workforce and establishing a kind of equality and all this kind of stuff was a huge cultural political priority for decades, and it's all been reversed, and nobody wants to talk about it. So there's that. I
wonder if they're homeschooling. Some of them.
Yeah, a lot of them are homeschooling, but they just, a lot of them just got out of the habit of having to slog to work, and now they just don't want to. They don't want to do it again. And among men, there's demographic effects. A lot of men just moved home with mom and dad for the pandemic, and they just left the workforce. But here's what's interesting about that. For a long time, we were ascribing the labor force shortage as attributable to the stimulus payments. That people were making enough money staying at home, so why would they feel the need to go to work? Well, those ended, and it's not really changed. So there's that, and you're seeing credit card. You're seeing consumer debt rising dramatically after having fallen dramatically. So savings are declining. Consumer credit is going way up. So people are really maxing out their credit cards right now.
Yeah.
So there are all those things. But I think in the end, and this is something I'm going to be exploring here in the future, but there is this funny thing that we've taken for granted in the whole of our lives, which you would call something like ambition, that extends from a conviction that if you work hard and you embrace the disutility of labor, that you're going to make progress, get ahead, and live a better life. Okay, that's just a basic idea that we've always accepted as true. And then one day that became not true. So we've socialized a whole generation of people into the idea that going to work is optional. And I think it might have just diminished the sort of life aspirations of many millions of people to the point that they don't feel like it anymore.
Well, something, I do think about this a lot as well, because there's a very similar phenomena here. And I think it is mostly younger people, which is to say people under 50. But, part of it, there's a book out called Shit Jobs or Lousy Jobs. It was quite a big phenomenon about how, people younger than us don't necessarily get to find their bliss doing what they want to do or whatever. And that's a big issue. But, do I just sound like an old fart when I say, I've done crappy jobs in my life to get where I am. I was a waitress. I loved it, actually. I've done crappy stuff, but I always liked the crappy stuff because work in and of itself and earning a paycheck had meaning to me. It meant freedom. I left a pretty, let's just say, exotic childhood in a very damaging household at a young age. And so making my own money and having my own life and running my own life was really a big deal. And I don't think that young people generally, obviously there are exceptions, but have the same relationship to a work ethic and get the same satisfaction out of a work ethic. And my theory is that part of that is that their minds are polluted by Instagram stories of people only doing glamorous jobs and only being in glamorous places, and that actually, being a waitress or a store clerk or something is kind of unworthy, and it doesn't pay well, and I'm not going to do that. Right? That's
You're right about that. There was this kind of weird, even 10 years ago, I think very troubling attack on basically working class jobs. That they're awful, and I agree with you. I mean, from a very early age, I was, moving pianos and doing fencing and digging wells, and my first job about which I was enormously proud was cleaning bathrooms in a department store and breaking down boxes, and vacuuming and digging around on change room floors to find the pins and polishing the glass. And I love that job. It was the happiest job I ever had. And then I became a busboy, and first I was a dishwasher, and that was just, I loved that. I love that job.
I'll bet the shift went fast because dishwashers are so busy in restaurant kitchens, aren't they? That you kind of clock in at 4 and, my God, it's midnight already. I had no.
Yeah, no, it's great. I remember when I walked into my first big dishwashing job was with a catering company, and it's kind of a classic sort of bad boss situation where they said, "Okay, hey, welcome. Wash all that." And there was, they had just catered like a 3,000 person event, and there were all the plates and all the trays from the roasts and all the potatoes, and it was just a tower of stuff. But for me, that was really exciting because it was it's just something to take on. And
right? Yeah.
I just threw myself into it in a big way. But I always felt that way about cleaning bathrooms in the department store too, because customers can do astonishing things in bathrooms. And you walk in and just like, oh, wow, that is. But then the goal is to make it pristine, And so it's a great challenge. It's very exciting. So I loved all these kind of jobs. So I used to be really offended by all these books about shit jobs and all this stuff.
Yeah, like I don't get. I think it's a bad idea to start telling people you have to enjoy everything every minute, because then they don't make themselves, enjoy. Right? I worked in a pizza place in North Vancouver, BC, and I lied about my age to get in there. Right, I was too young, but I looked older, so I got it and lied about. I said, "Oh, I've been working in California. That's where my references are." I knew they wouldn't call. It was a total lie. But I worked a shift that went from 4 p.m. until 1 a.m. because it was a steak and pizza place, right? So we do the dinner rush between like 5:30 and 7 or 8. Then it would slow down. Then there'd be the kind of, after the movie pizza rush between about like 9 and 11. And then there'd be another pizza rush when the bars closed in the area. So I was serving a lot of tables, Jeffrey. But it was I would serve 52 tables a night. I was making a fortune because I already tipped then. And the goal for me, here was the goal. If I had a grumpy customer, my goal would be, how do I win this guy over? Right? It was a challenge. I'm gonna flirt and charm and be the most perfect waitress ever to see if I can turn this guy around. And that made the night went faster. By 1, 2 a.m. My tip jar was full. I was exhausted in a great way. And I felt, even though I was super smart and should have been in law school or something, I wasn't. I was doing that. And it was very satisfying for me.
Yeah, I loved work, and mainly because it gave me a new community. I met new people, different kinds of people. These were not my parents, they're not my pastor, they're not my teacher. There's something completely different, and I loved getting to know my bosses, even if they're jerks, or my colleagues, even if they're potheads, whatever. I loved just being exposed to a kind of a new world. But I think so you're right that this 10-year-old attack on work, goes back in the cultural moment. But then with lockdowns, it was just, that was like the government putting its imprimatur on the idea that your work is definitely an option. If it's not safe, don't do it. And then you have the additional problem that it destabilized people's property rights, small businesses, So suddenly they weren't in charge of their own companies anymore. and we had enormous privileges for big box stores, but the small groceries, all had to shut by edict. And you can't have a growing and prosperous society under those conditions.
No.
It's just, it doesn't work. And so there was a mighty kind of cultural impact of these lockdowns that to change the assumptions that we have about how the world's supposed to work. And that has surely impacted us in big ways that maybe it's not going to be fixed for decades. I just don't know, especially when you don't have apologies for it, and when you don't have investigations about why did this happen, who came up with the idea of essential, unessential, why were the hospitals closed to all non-COVID patients? Why did business get forced to put plexiglass up all over the place? There's just so many questions we have. And the school closures, we still don't know, who ordered those initially and on what basis. So we've got years of investigation to do. It's just been a complete calamity, really.
Well, and I know that you have started an initiative about how we make people take stock, but I just wanted to ask you something more on the work topic, because the work from home thing, it was also a big problem for me. I didn't understand in the first place why Canada was extremely generous with money for people to stay home. And now it turns out everybody was ripping off and they're going after them. But I thought, why are they giving people so much money to stay home? I don't kind of get that. And then the work from home thing now it's kind of a settled societal thing, right? Where people don't want to go back to work. I read an article a couple of weeks ago about one of the top people at, I can't remember if it was Apple or Google, some huge company. And he said, I'm not coming in the 3 days a week you want me to. If I can't work from home, I'm quitting. Right. So this 35-year-old gazillionaire just stopped working because he didn't want to go into the office, which, again, for me, as someone of a previous generation, office culture is so important to society. Having a coffee at the coffee machine, taking meetings in person, laying eyes on somebody you might have a beef with and seeing, oh, that's someone I want to be friends with, right? Like all that goes out the window, and these people want to sit at home, isolated, doing their work from home thing. And I think that also is going to be a terrible legacy of this. They got a taste for it now and they don't want to give it up.
Yeah, and it destroys the work ethic, what we used to call the work ethics, which nobody talks about anymore. But it's actually a difficult work ethic is something that has to be trained and experienced. It doesn't automatically occur to you. It's something that comes out of what you went through and what I went through and what all of our children have to eventually confront. They have to finally realize the relationship between their effort and the reward they get in wages.
I mean, I sound like my father now, right? I mean, I sound like an old parent saying, we used to walk 3 miles in the snow back in the day. But I really, look, I'll tell you something about me, Jeffrey, is that I did have a hard knock life. And the thing that always saved me, that made me a famous journalist, and I got all the riches that came with that until I blew my life up. But I had a pretty big life with not much support in my background. And what saved me was my work ethic. I worked harder than anybody. My first job in the business, I worked for free for 3 months so that they would put me on the radio, right? And did I bitch about it? I was just so happy to be at that radio station. I worked my butt off and I knew I was good. And then I just kind of got better and better jobs. But I worked harder than anybody. And of course, in those days too, I was competing with men. So we outworked the men and we outdrank the men. And one got ahead. I don't see that generally in young people anymore either.
No, it has to be trained. And unfortunately, if you go from a world where you don't work in junior high, you don't work in high school, then you go to college, which is a 4-year vacation funded by somebody else. And then you've got your ridiculous degree. Yeah. And then you wave it around and demand somebody hires you, and you get hired, if it's the right kind of degree, at a 6-figure salary or something like that, and then you immediately realize that you don't have to do anything to earn this thing. Then lockdowns happen, you can just sit at home. I mean, that does instill a kind of different way of thinking, and it's potentially very problematic for a whole generation of people.
Yeah. Well, I think it's problematic psychologically for them too, right? Elon Musk said today or yesterday that he thinks work from home is really dangerous and he won't tolerate it in his company. So that's good.
Yeah. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
I thought that was just great. He says what everybody was thinking. But, my general impression is that, and this was part of the problems of the lockdowns, it was all kind of a Zoom a professional class
deal
racket.
Yeah.
That, I don't know, I don't know how you estimate this, but half or more than half of American people in that upper strata, 6-figure strata of professional jobs don't actually do anything. They don't. I mean, that's my whole impression.
Yeah.
They don't do anything, and our businesses are so puffed up with administrative apparatus. Not with people who are working hard, but just the compliance machinery.
Yeah, that's true. I know.
And that's stuff you can do in 5-10 minutes a day. You're hired to be a compliance officer or whatever. And what does that even mean? Well, you're working for the HR department. Well, what does that even mean? So, yeah, it after a while, it just feels like the money flows like a river, and you don't have to do anything to get it. And you don't have you begin to think life is a scam. Essentially, especially with lockdowns.
Yeah.
Suddenly you can continue the scam. You used to go to the office and not work. Now you can just stay home and not work,
Right.
I mean, it's potentially a disaster for prosperity. I think it's the old sort of daring do, ambition, work hard, get ahead ethos seems to be on the wane. We also have such a stratified society now that there's people who somebody said to me the other day, something that's very obvious, that you can divide the workforce up into the virtuals and the physicals. There's people who do actual work.
Yeah.
And then there's the virtuals, and half of them, or 3/4 of them, if not 9/10 of them, don't do anything. So lockdowns were great for that class. Yeah. They loved it.
Yeah, they must have loved it. So I want to read something that you wrote, just a little paragraph here, and ask you about it, because I think it's really smart. You said, so yes, as with millions of others, my naivete is gone, replaced by a harder, tougher, and more realistic understanding of the great struggles we face. People in wartime in the past must have gone through such similar transformations. It affects us all personally and intellectually. It's the great moment when we realize that no outcome is baked into the fabric of history. The lives we live are not granted to us by anyone, that we must make for ourselves. I think it really captures a moment, right? I'm just now really taking on board that things are not going to be like they were before ever again. And I think that kind of captures it as well. I'm just wondering how you're sort of coping with that idea. I mean, personally, you write beautifully, and
thank you.
You're a great writer. And you're also pretty prolific, which is like, you're way faster writer than I am. But
well, that article was painful for me to write, and I have been wanting to write that article for a while, and it all came out of a conversation I was having with somebody the previous day, and I was talking about, gosh, I used to think this, now I think this. I used to think this, but boy, was that dumb. And she said to me, well, you really should write this up. So I did. I just kind of listed 5 ways in which my worldview has changed, and in shocking ways, and not in the sense of like politically or something like that, but in more in my own understanding of the trajectory of history. So I used to think that, for example, that ever more prosperity, liberty, and peace was just going to happen to us just by virtue of information economics. That we had more information than we've ever had. I look back at the history of totalitarianism, and what I'd see predominating in those periods was ignorance. That people just didn't know what Stalin was doing to Ukraine, or people thought that Mussolini was a great central planner, or Hitler was a harmless guy, and so on. So I thought the internet would fix all that, and so now we're just flooded with this tremendous torrents of information every second, trillions of bits of information flooded on our heads. We can find out anything we want, but it didn't make any difference in terms of the overall ignorance of the population following these myths. So it really caused me to rethink a lot of my assumptions about what goes wrong in society. And so we have to look for other explanations besides just a lack of information. And, I finally take recourse to the fact that, well, the problem is that, the floods of information do not overcome weak judgment and lack of wisdom and moral cowardice. Those are much more powerful. And that was a tough thing for me to come to terms with. The article kind of marches on and goes through, I once really trusted big tech, and something went wrong there in a big way. Another thing I didn't understand entirely was just how officious and imperialistic was the administrative state. That really Western societies are not governed by politicians as such. They're governed by lifetime employees of the administrative state, over which elected politicians have very little control. And to me, that's a tremendous challenge, for anybody who believes in democracy and freedom. How did it come to be that we erected this machinery, and what do we do about it? And I that's an overwhelming problem that we're going to have to deal with. And I don't have the answers, but at least we need to start zeroing in on the problem. Then I've got two more things that I kind of talked about. One was the question of inequality. I didn't used to worry about it. Like, it didn't matter to me. Some people were rich, some people were poor. As long as everybody has mobility, then it's not a problem. The thing is that the class stratification that's affected the Western world now has really sort of shattered the empathy that classes have for each other's plight, and it's caused with the lack of mobility. Like, if you're born into a realm where you're destined to be a white collar 6-figure guy with a fancy income, you're aware that if you ever lose that position, you may never get it back. So it trains people to be sort of more grasping and selfish than they otherwise would be. And that's a serious problem. I think we need to, address that. And then the final issue has to do with the role of mob psychology, which I had never seen anything like what happened over the last couple of years.
It's shocking, right?
Yeah, I was aware of moments in history where the mob, did dangerous things, like the Red Guard under the Cultural Revolution, or the witch burnings of the Middle Ages. And, you can find mob violence and hysterias at various periods of history. But I just somehow didn't expect that we'd see it in our own time. And in a 21st century modern world, that you could turn people very quickly from being rational individuals into compliance fanatics.
Yeah, no, it's true. Absolutely.
Willing to use intimidation and violence, and then all the segregations and the demonization campaigns that were masked, unmasked, vaxxed, unvaxxed, red versus blue, and so on. These social divisions that the mob mentalities created was grotesque to watch, and to know that potential is always there. It doesn't matter how fancy or modern we are. We're always, on the cusp of reverting to very brutal, primitive people. That's quite a revelation. I never knew that was possible.
Yeah, I don't like it. I mean, we know it happened historically, but we thought, I guess for me, I thought we'd move past that.
Right.
Right.
That was my overall impression. Looking back, I wrote in that article that I feel like the 2019 me was some sort of Victorian wig, naive and thinking that we've solved all the problems. It's just a matter of cleaning up a few details here and there.
Yeah, me too.
And then it turned out that, we just dismantled, all the basic things we claim to believe in: equality, democracy, equal access to justice, and non-discrimination. All these things were just suddenly thrown out the window. Freedom, all the things, all the incantations we make. None of those values seem to matter for the better part of 2 years. That's a trauma, Trish.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't just move on from this. We have to come to terms with it.
It is a big trauma, and it's going to be hard to come to terms. But I'm coming sort of to the end of my life eventually. Like I maybe have got 15 years left, maybe if I'm lucky, and I sort of hope it fixes itself before I die, because I don't want to leave this to my kids. But I actually don't know what to do about it, right? And they're kind of in their prime. They've had a little bit of a foot in our old world, but they're also very much part of the new world, right? And so I realize that when we discuss these things, and I can't assume empathetic responses to some of the things that you and I are talking about, because they don't understand them, right? They don't understand what I'm talking about. They're both good kids, but they grew up on the internet. Your trust in big tech point is, I think it's really important. And I've realized recently, gradually, but recently, that the culture in the big tech companies is actually an alien and antithetical culture to a vibrant democracy, right? They hire people who I think outside a very narrow window are not that bright. I don't think they're thinking about the big philosophical questions. They know how to do a couple things really, really well, things I would not even understand what they do. But they aren't the people who should be in charge of how we're living our lives and what should be censored and what the big questions are, because they don't seem interested in them, and they don't seem to get it, right? So all of a sudden, the most powerful thing in the world is run by some of the most limited people in the world. And there doesn't seem to be anything we can do about that either, except for Elon. He's our hope.
Well, this is a weird thing, too. I used to think that the insanities of the universities and academia were walled off and really posed no grave threat to civilization. I mean, it's just these weird places doing weird things.
Yeah.
But it turns out that a substantial number of those people graduate from these fancy institutions with no education whatsoever.
Yeah.
And just a series of doctrines that they've been told to believe in. And then they go to work, and they're in a position to deploy their worldviews in service of censorship. I mean, the lack of basic belief in freedom and human dignity is shocking to me.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
But that's that whole generation that's working at Twitter and Facebook, and so the nuttiness of academia has spilled into the tech realm, and it's invaded our lives. So, what you see on that little doohickey you carry around in your pocket is entirely being scripted by these woke, ill-educated people that just have no background whatsoever.
Woke and intransigent, right? That's rigid in the way that they think.
Yeah, and I don't know how you fix that. Like, I don't know if Elon's going to take over Twitter or not, but even if he does, he's going to be confronting a tremendous machinery, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
These things don't happen by accident. It's not just bad management that makes it. It's something else. It's very deep, very powerful.
Well, and what I think the other thing, maybe this is the same for you too, is that when the guy who took over from Jack Dorsey, I think his name is Agarwal, of Twitter, there's a clip of him saying, "Oh, we don't believe in free speech. We don't even think as a principle it has any merit at all." Like, people are saying things in those industries that even 5 years ago, I think, would have been verboten, right? It's just, or are we just realizing it now? I don't know. But for the head of a communications company to say, "Oh, we don't even believe in that. That's old fashioned. We love censoring people. That's why it was a remarkable thing for him to say."
I think, I don't, I can't say for sure, but I think a lot of it may have to do with Trump derangement syndrome, because when he came into office in 2016, he wasn't supposed to win, and he did win anyway. And all this whole generation was cheering for Hillary Clinton. They got mad about it, and they thought, well, the people and their ideas and their speech is really the enemy. And now we've got an existential struggle for the future of civilization. And we've got to keep the deplorables at bay.
Yeah. And
they use their power to do that.
Do they ever?
And so, they when they're figuring out what post to let through and what to, they're just trying to sniff out Trump supporters all the time. And, that's the main thing. And they got really bad in the pandemic because if you posted something like, well, masks don't work, you must be a Trump person.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to get a vaccine. Oh, you must be a Trump person. Mm-hmm. And so they're just targeting these people in a kind of civil war, against people's politics.
Well, what's interesting about that is that if you were going to compare people some who voted for Trump and some who were for Hillary in those two categories, that it seems that, like, I am no fan of Hillary Clinton. Everyone on the show knows that. I think she's a terrible Secretary of State. I think she's corrupt and a liar. I think she does anything for women. I'm like Christopher Hitchens. I'm irrational about Hillary Clinton because the facts do not back up anything about her, right? So it seems to me that the people who are so in love with Hillary are in love with what she purports to represent, but doesn't represent at all, right?
Right.
And then with Trump, who I'm kind of agnostic about, but he was not as bad as they said he was. They didn't need to fear him. He is not the one who's leading us close to nuclear war over Ukraine right now, by the way.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? He did some good things, and he was kind of a buffoon, but also really smart about some things. I thought he was vulgar, and I didn't love the fact that he called a woman a dog. I forget who it was, one of the primary candidates running against him, but that's awful. But Trump had actually more substantive good things going for him in the realm of governance than she did, right? So one is about appearances and veneer, and the other one is about actually being able to do something. And it seems that the lefty Hillary supporters are always much more fired up about veneer, right, and kind of cultural politics than actual results.
Oh, that's for sure. I was never a Trump fan, and I was one of the early never Trumpers. Now, I had this doubt because a lot of people on the right were talking about Trump derangement syndrome. I wasn't sure that it really existed, but then I gradually realized it did. That it's possible. And again, I wrote an entire book, against the guy's ideological structure. I'm not a fan of nationalism. I thought there was too much of this dog whistling, over issues of race and religion. I don't like any of that stuff. But it was possible to have an irrational hatred to the point that that you're willing to do anything to wreck all of his achievements and even deny and erase his presidency. And I think as lockdowns went on, this was a major part of the goal.
Yes. And well, look at Sussman yesterday. I mean, that was just a ridiculous decision. And it makes people feel like, like all the pillars are really crumbling. The evidence against Sussman was huge. The jury there was many, many Trump haters and many, many Hillary voters and donors, including the judge, involved in that case. So, I think people just feel that unless you're with the narrative, you're with the kind of left-wing program, that you don't have a voice or a choice in any of these things, right? Regardless of what you think of Trump, his voters had a right to have him governing, and the Russia hoax prevented him from governing, actually. So, I think people are just worn out by the unfairness of it all and the corruption.
The New York Times, after 2016, after Trump won, sent out a note saying, summarizing, we really got this wrong. We didn't understand that there was such a constituency out there for what Trump represents. And as the paper of record, we want to represent all points of view. So we're going to be making changes around here to diversify our opinion pages and our reporter pools and just try to, because, they were completely wrong about everything. It's Hillary's going to, And so they really went through a period of rethinking. Of course, that was the old generation there. And they hired a new op-ed editor, a new head of the editorial page, some new newsroom people, and they're going to really go back to what they've always kind of aspired to be, which is this, slightly left of center chronicler of American life. And so, but that lasted about a year, and then all those new hires were purged. So,
like that Barry Weiss, because she bailed, right?
Yeah. So a lot of these people that were hired in the year after 2016 were just thrown out, and they decided, look, this is too important to us. We might have these old-fashioned principles to chronicle American life, but actually it's something even more important, which is hating the guts of Trump and pushing this woke agenda.
Yeah.
And a lot of institutions have gone in this direction. The ACLU is a great case in point, right? Yeah. So, lockdowns are the ultimate violation of civil liberties and censorship and all the rest of it. And you'd think the ACLU would have been very busy, but instead they made an institutional decision to follow the left on everything. So they were pro-lockdown and pro-vax mandate, and we've lost the ACLU. It's actually an incredible thing.
It is an incredible thing. So let's talk about what you're doing next. I understand that you had, you were the people who facilitated the Great Barrington Declaration. So yay. And now I hope that you have a kind of a similar consciousness raising for people through your next project, which is accountability. And so tell me about that project and where you want it to go.
Well, it's part of the problem we're seeing is, we've talked about it this whole podcast, that people just kind of want to move on and don't want to talk about it and don't want to. There were several commissions that were scheduled to take place this year, and they scheduled them last year. It's funded by all the major Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, blah blah blah, and they had all the researchers lined up, and they're going to be a real serious commission on COVID response, and then it just completely disbanded because, of course, it was a disastrous response, and there's no way they could hide the harms that they did to society, so the whole thing just kind of went away.
Wow.
And so the problem with that is that, what's going to replace it? Are there going to be new COVID commissions? And are we ever going to have a full accounting? We're going to get answers to these questions. Why did we lock down? What happened in February 2020 to flip Fauci from being anti-lockdown to pro-lockdown? What was the role of the gain-of-function research? Why did they close schools? You could just go through this list. Why were the economists never consulted on any of this? How come the news media served as such a sort of handmaiden of lockdowns? All these, the coverage in the United States by the news media was 90% pro-lockdown.
Same here.
It was incredible.
Yeah.
So the problem we face is, first of all, inspiring these commissions to take place, but then also provide an agenda for the commissions, because there's so much at stake. There's so many issues to cover. And the longer time goes on, the more likely people are to forget about the essential questions. So we're putting together a series of documents that are chronicling, in public health and in economics and in media culture, all of the things that went wrong, and just so that we can remember, and then asking all the salient questions to present as a kind of an agenda for investigation for the future. That's the goal, because otherwise these commissions are going to be too limited, and there's going to be too many really crimes against humanity that are just sort of forgotten, and we can't forget. So that's the purpose of these documents, is just to, and whether these commissions develop within a year or 5 years or 10 years or 50 years, the issue is that we need to remember and understand and find out who is doing what to whom, and to learn lessons from it. So and as far as I know, the Brownstone Institute is the only institute that's doing this. There's some of this going on in the UK, but there's nothing like that going on in the US or Canada. So we're just beginning the initiative now.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And here's what I fear. I've been old enough to have lived through a number of various commissions, certainly the 9/11 Commission, which actually you should read this article. If I can find it, I'll send it to you. It's called Commission as Whitewash by a guy named Benjamin DeMott. It was a cover of Harper's Magazine. And he just rips the 9/11 Commission report, a new one, because it was devised to make people not have any negative reaction to how things were handled prior to the day and during the day after the day, right? It was a big effort in massaging information, and it was very valuable to read his criticism. It was scathing. And so, as you know, Jeffrey, sometimes these commissions are invented particularly to whitewash things, right? So what you're doing is very valuable. Somebody has to watchdog them. And I hope someday that if there is a big one, they'll put you and other people like you on it,
Well, I hope so. And there's many people who know, and a lot of the information is not being revealed to the public. Again, February 2020, we don't have much information about what Fauci and Farrar and Collins and these people were actually talking about on their burner phones. And
I know.
And we don't know, what was going on, and how come the conclusion that it wasn't a lab leak, was generated February 4th and then finally published March 16th. How did they decide that it was? And of course, that paper's been debunked ever since. But what was the agenda and what was the goal? Basically, what inspired the lockdowns?
Yeah.
And we need to know this.
Well, for me, the question too, and maybe this is not a question for an inquiry, it's more of a philosophical question about who we are as people, at this particular time in history. I will never get over, and this is what drives me, the cruelty that we participated in and the cruelty that we witnessed happening and saying nothing. For nurses in an old age home to allow them to be locked away that way, for people to accept saying goodbye to their loved one on an iPad. I mean, what the hell? Like it things that people would never, if you'd said 5 years ago, your husband's going to die of cancer, but you can't go see him when he's in the hospital because the government said so, you'd say that's nuts. I'd go in there with, guns a-blazing or something. But how quickly we passively accepted the unthinkable.
Yeah, and there's other issues too. How come? I'm not sure what happened in Canada, but it happened in a lot of places in the world, especially all over the U.S. Just from one day to the next, we went from having normal medical systems to saving all hospital resources for COVID only.
Yeah, and
getting rid of all elective surgeries and diagnostics. And healthcare spending plummeted. It plummeted in the middle of a pandemic. Who issued those orders, and where did they come from? Who was responsible for that? And how come in a federal system like ours did they go into place on the same day all over the whole country? We need to know these questions.
And how come, then I would say, as someone with a journalism background, as a follow-up, why did the media only do stories about people with COVID? They didn't do big stories about, this woman's husband died of cancer because he didn't get a surgery. There wasn't very much of that going around, right? It was all the reporting was in service of a narrative that was really an unsupportable narrative, and they jumped right in. That I don't get. There were a million human interest stories they could have done to show that lockdowns and those kind of hospital considerations were dangerous, but they didn't do it. Why didn't they do it? I don't understand it.
Yeah, the lack of press interest in this is very, very interesting to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we have a media document that kind of chronicles all this, that goes through all the stories, where, every time a state would open up, you get, the Associated Press and the New York Times or the Washington Post saying, Texas's experiment in mass carnage, this kind of stuff. None of it turned out.
Or Ron DeSantis has blood on his hands or something. Yeah,
DeSantis. Or the big attacks on the Sturgis motorcycle gatherings in the Dakotas, 2 successive years of saying, hundreds of thousands are going to die because of these things. It's just the lack of critical intelligence. I mean, the press just became wildly pro-lockdown. It's just out of control. We have one document in here that is really nothing but a timeline, and it's truly hilarious. Spring break revelers, super spreaders, and none of it's true, and none of it turned out to be true. But they were the top headlines in all the newspapers for 2 years. It's just incredible. There's other strange things. Like a lot of people thought, I heard a lot of people say this, and I kind of thought it might be true too, that after Biden was elected, all this stuff would go away.
Yeah.
But they couldn't help themselves, and they instead they went the opposite direction. They go the nationwide mask mandates came into place, the vaccine mandates came into place. Suddenly, New York City was shut off to everybody who was not vaccinated. I mean, just unbelievable stuff was taking place.
Well, I think the other thing that happened is that there is a real kind of 2 tribes about the media too. And I'll give you an example. We got a guy here in Canada, in Ontario, named Roman Baber, who was an early lockdown opposer in the Conservative Party, and he was kicked out of caucus, but very, very brave. He understands the issue really, really well. And he was on CBC television, which is pro-lockdown, pro-mandates. They're just like very, very, very linear in their approach. They hated the truckers. They lied about the truckers. So they have Roman on to discuss mandates, and it was their top interviewer too, this really tough woman. And she was not used to interviewing people on the other side who knew their stuff the way that Roman did, right? And he made her look ridiculous. And what I know as a journalist, especially when I did a lot of investigative stuff and tough interviews, including a really tough one with Tony Fauci back in the day, is that what's happening now would not be happening, could not have happened if the news media had been interviewing smart people on both sides. But they didn't do that. You didn't see these big, if Tony Fauci came on this show, I could make him look pretty bad because I know what I'm talking about, right? But he didn't do these shows. You didn't see Tony Fauci having to actually ever defend the decisions he was making, like nobody's bugging our prime minister about the mandates, the vaccine mandates for travel, because the media is all in love with him. So you'll never see him get beaten up. They do a bit in Parliament now. Some of the Conservative MPs are going after him, and he can't manage it because it's not underpinned by science. But you're not seeing robust criticism and interviews in the media because the pro-lockdown people interview pro-lockdown people. That's who they don't take on somebody who might be slippery because they know what they're talking about, right?
Well, there was something like a dozen so-called experts, that were interviewed by everybody in the Western press again and again and again.
Yes.
And
Same here.
Whether they had credentials or not, they made good television. So, and they're ideologically aligned with the interest. And that's fascinating to me too. I mean, what if the reason the media was all in favor of lockdowns is because they financially benefited from it, just making everybody stay at home watching their televisions or turning on their laptops and staring. I mean, that's a really interesting question to me. They're pursuing their private commercial interests over the public interest. Did that actually happen? I'd like to know.
Nothing would be off limits on that kind of thinking about the media. I have such little respect for them now. But Paul Alexander did say, I mean, his point when he said that he was begging them to start highlighting the problems for children of school closures. He said they hated Trump, and if reopening the schools made Trump look good, they weren't going to do any reporting to support that. That's what happened there, right? They think that they think they're maybe doing something great by always opposing everything Trump ever did. So therefore,
I think that's right. And then that persisted after Trump was gone, because the hatred of Trump was so deep that they're like, well, let's do something that Trump would never do, So suddenly it's the mask mandates, 100 days to to end the pandemic, 100 days of masking. That was the initial one. Yeah. And then there's the vaccine mandates, and so they knew that Trump would never have done this. So they kept up this anti-Trump governance style for from January 21 all the way to now.
But we did it here too, right? We're doing it here too, and Trump wasn't even in this country. But we were captured. Our left-wing politicians were captured by that same absolute lunacy, right?
Isn't that something?
It is something. It is something. So when is this thing going to be, these documents? Do you have a timeline? Will it be published?
Well, I think we're going to release them one at a time probably. Okay. And I think probably the first one to come out will be the economics one, because that one seems like the most developed one. So, and I'm thinking about it, and that's a huge document, so I might just put it on Amazon as a book, actually.
Yeah, you should.
But I'll make it free on Brownstone too. And then the second one will be the media one, and the third one's the really big one, and that'll be the public health document.
Oh,
yeah, that could be another month or even two. I'm not sure exactly where that one stands, but that one has the most difficult stuff to have to deal with. Like, why was mRNA technology favored over traditional vaccines? How come the CDC did not talk about natural immunity? How come natural immunity was never part of our thinking throughout the entire pandemic, even though it emerges that it's the way we get through the pandemic, and we know this now.
But also, let's not forget about that too, Jeffrey. Let's not forget the Fauci emails where, when Great Barrington came out, he was saying these are fringe people and we must stop them, and that somebody needs to account for that, right? He was so arrogant and so full of himself that he couldn't entertain another idea from massively credentialed people, and set about to start a smear campaign, which he did.
Yeah. So that was a scandal. Right. I mean, you'd think that would be.
He said they're fringe. Fringe is actually a good thing to be these days.
Fringe epidemiologists, and called for an attack on them. I was looking at the dates of that whole thing. So Collins wrote Fauci and said we gotta have a quick takedown of these people, and Fauci wrote him back within minutes and pointed him to 3 articles that had come out the day before. So what's missing from that little email exchange is whether Fauci had something to do with actually commissioning those articles. Now, my read on Collins is that he was a little bit out of the loop. So, he might have just sent that note to Fauci. Hey, it's Great Barrington people getting on my nerves. I think that was on the 8th.
Yeah.
But on the 6th and 7th, the articles attacking Great Barrington Declaration came out. So did Fauci commission those articles? Did he encourage them?
He had some relationship with this cat named Gonzalez, I believe, who is an epidemiologist but also writes. Right. And there was some connection there about putting some of this stuff into the public domain directly between Fauci and Gonzalez, I believe. And Gonzalez, I think, even wrote back saying he'd done it. I'd have to see if I can find him and pull him out. But
yeah, he was a very interesting guy, Gonzalez, because I'm just going to make up a date here and say it was like February 18th. He released a big report that was signed by 800 doctors and public health people, medical scientists that was warning against lockdowns. That was middle of February, and that's a pretty decent document.
Wow. So what happened? It must be politics. Which way is the wind going to blow? You know, I mean, the other thing about Gonzalez, I can't even bear to look at his Twitter account anymore. It's so offensive on COVID. But is that he was around kind of at the end of the AIDS politics. And what's always bothered me about that is that, and I knew some of those guys well because I covered it and loved some of the ones too, many who died. But that it's a really interesting political bedfellow situation because technically the guys who lived through AIDS and the activists should be on the side of the COVID skeptics, knowing because they know how corrupt the system is, right? But because they're lefty, or they tend to be lefty, they were hoodwinked into going with the official narrative and dumping on the policy position that I think they would be more naturally allied to. I was very upset by that because I thought they might ride to the rescue, but they didn't. In fact, they were praising Fauci's credibility, even though they've been wearing Fauci as a murderer signs, in the 1980s, right? It was very...
Well, it became a bit of an establishment. So when Fauci changed his mind about lockdowns, they just changed with him.
Yeah.
It was very easy.
Yeah.
They just flipped.
Yeah.
And that happened sometime, I would say like between the 24th and 25th and 26th of February, because on January the 27th, the New York Times came out guns a-blazing with their big podcast with Donald J. McNeil, predicting 6 million dead. Now that was a scary podcast, right? Because, I mean, New York Times after 100 years has always been about good messaging surrounding public health. Stay calm, you get sick, see your doctor, we've got this, don't worry about it. That's always what they said. 68, 69, 57, 58, and so on. They said that about polio. But suddenly, February 27th, they flipped that whole thing and really... It's definitely worth listening to. It's an interview between Marco Barbero and Donald J. McNeil. And that podcast has 2 or 3 million subscribers.
Wow.
So it's a big thing. But it was definitely constructed to whip up public panic. Here's what I find fascinating about it is on that same day, the New York Times op-ed page ran an article saying that this is disease X. We've always known that disease X was coming. Disease X is here. We have to take extreme measures to deal with it. We'll get through it, and there'll be another pandemic in the future. So don't pay a whole lot of attention to this one. Just comply, go along. The author of that piece is Peter Daszak. Now, Peter Daszak is the head of the EcoHealth Alliance, who received a big grant from NIH because he was good friends with Fauci. They met at the Cosmo Club in D.C. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's an insufferable place. Yeah. It's the kind of place if you're an anarchist, it would be a great place. I'll stop right there.
I know.
But,
you better.
I'll stop right there. Yeah. But Cosmo Club is insufferable. But the women have come in the back interest and all this kind of stuff. It's just outrageous.
Really?
But anyway, that's where Daszak and Fauci met. And then Daszak somehow gets this grant from NIH and then funnels the money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so that's Daszak. He's not really a scientist or anything. He just runs this nonprofit racket. So I'm looking at the situation and thinking, of all the op-eds in the world that the New York Times could have run on February 27th, why did they pick Peter Daszak to be the very first guy to write about that on their op-ed page? And then, of course, the next day, they had Donald J. McNeil, this is the 28th, writing about the need to go medieval on the virus, and lock people in the poison cities and that sort of thing. But this Daszak piece is really interesting because it's, also the piece says that the virus was definitely, created by the wet markets in China.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So So there's no question that there was an agenda with that piece. But, we know this goes on. These people just are not making random decisions. We know that Fauci has tremendous influence. But my speculation is that sometime between the middle of February and the 27th of February, Fauci got all of his ducks lined up. He met with top editors at the Washington Post, brought in all of his top thinkers, met with his deputy assistant. They laid out a whole media strategy for warming people up to locking down. And Fauci's first message about lockdowns went out, I think, February 26th, where he writes Morgan Fairchild, of all people, and says, hey, you might want to tell Morgan Fairchild, you might want to write your followers and tell them that we're going to have to close the schools and the churches and everything and limit gatherings. So that was his first talk about lockdowns, was to Morgan Fairchild. And then a day later, Dazzik's got an op-ed in the New York Times. And on the same day, Donald J. McNeil's whipping up disease, panic, and frenzy on the podcast. The next day, dishonest. They call for going medieval on the disease. All this happened between the 26th, 27th, and 28th. And a week later, South by Southwest was closed by the Austin city mayor. And then 4 days after that, Trump announces the travel restrictions. And then that weekend, Fauci is huddling with Birx and what's the son-in-law's name? Kushner, and persuading Trump to lock down the economy. Xi Jinping did it. He's a great man. He's loved by his people for it. You too can crush this virus. And my own theory about all this stuff is that, my theory, again, it's a theory.
Yeah.
That I think they were convinced that it was a lab leak. Dazzik was responsible for it.
I do too. Yeah.
And that Fauci's view was that this thing has the potential to spread, unlike SARS-CoV-1, that has the potential to become a global pandemic. And the best hope they have for preventing that would be locking down. And even if that didn't ultimately work, at least it would cause so much chaos that people would at least lose track of the story of the lab leak as a way of preserving their professional reputations. That's my own theory.
I think it's a good one. I think too that Fauci may have thought it was a lab leak and maybe very unpredictable, right? Like maybe some of the warnings they were putting out, he thought actually might be true, because if it's an engineered virus that is unpredictable, maybe they actually didn't really know, and they won't admit that now.
That's possible. What's interesting about this, though, is that it's a little confusing because by January, middle of January, we had pretty good reports from China on the demographics.
Yeah, we did. Of course we did. I thought about that. Yeah.
Why? So the problem with my story is that basically we knew this was not a severe virus, but it was going to be very widespread. Annoying, to be sure. Potentially devastating to a certain demographic. But for most everybody else, not severe, but very prevalent. Those tend to go on trade-offs. So Fauci is looking at the numbers, so he knew this. So I'd say that's like a hole in my theory. Like, why did he rally around lockdowns as a means of suppressing this virus if he knew that in the long run, everybody's going to get it? Maybe he didn't know that. Maybe he really thought he was just going to buy himself time.
Yeah.
And maybe the idea was that he hated Trump, Maybe he was going to promote lockdowns between March and November as a way of destroying the economy to make sure that Trump couldn't win the election. That's possible, but that's a political motivation.
Yeah, I think so. There might be some truth to that, because it's not just that it would crash the economy, but it presented an ongoing negative narrative about the president if they wanted to use it, right? I mean, the media were terrible to Trump about COVID on every issue. And so it gave them, a bit of a narrative to use against him, I think, too. So that makes sense. I mean, Fauci's a very political guy, as you know. So, that could have been part of the plan.
The idea of the virus is that it served as a metaphor for Trump himself. And so this is a disease, because of Trump, this is a diseased, pathogenic country. We've got a pathogen unloose in the land, and its name is Trump.
Yeah.
So you could very easily conflate those things in a kind of mystical way, that Trump is the virus. So you have to suppress the virus. In the same sense, you should have to suppress Trump and his influence. There was that sort of mystical, metaphorical element to the whole thing.
And then the lockdowns become kind of a cleansing ritual, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Jeffrey, I'm so excited that you guys are working toward accountability. I hope there's something like that here, and we'll certainly use whatever documents you produce there as a roadmap to try to get something. I'm not holding out any hope. This is no longer a democracy. It's a failed state. But it would be great to at least enlighten the media and the public so that they can understand what's happened. So as usual, I'm grateful that you're forward thinking and for all the work you do. It's really, really valuable, and it gives me hope. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. But, the purpose of these documents is really not just to be, I think you're right about this, they're not just an American documents. They're not just for the incoming Republican Senate, although they'll be very useful for them. But there should be investigations in every state, every city, every county, every small town, and every country all over the world, because this happened in most every country. So, and mostly in the same way, right? So
well, there has to be also taking into account the new world we live in, where the media doesn't want to report on any of this stuff. There has to be a commission or an inquiry of such a high profile that they can't not report on it, right? There's been some stuff going on in the UK that was pretty interesting, where you had the modelers saying, well, we didn't actually mean that stuff. We were just guessing. You shouldn't have made policy on it. They actually said that under oath, right?
Sure.
But it didn't get a lot of play over here. And this is what I've learned in the last kind of 5 years. It's kind of like if a tree falls, if the media doesn't report it or signal the importance of something by treating it a certain way in a publication, it has no traction.
That's right.
Right. And so that's the other hill that we must climb here. But with people like you in the world, I feel like it can be done. So I'm glad you did this today, Jeffrey, also because I know you're not feeling well.
Oh, right. I'm a little under the weather, but all of our immune systems are degraded, so we catch everything that comes along. But just doing the podcast with you, Trish, made me feel better. So
thank you. Same here. I'm sad about not being able to go to my son's graduation on Friday, so talking to you has made me feel better too. It's just nice to know there's smart people out there thinking this stuff. It's great, and it's great for our listeners too.
Well, Brownstone is all over it. We do it every single day, and everybody else wants to move on. We're not moving on. I think there's too much to go into, and I write about the subject every day. I have an article by a Swiss political theorist, a political scientist, actually, not Swiss, Swedish. Today, it's called the authoritarian pandemic response, a reckoning. And it's just great. I mean, it's just filled with great links about all the devastating effects of lockdowns, and it's just a really powerful piece. But I love publishing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and you guys are doing great work. I hope people go to Brownstone. As I said, you're very prolific. Every time I go to Brownstone, you've got a new piece up. It's unbelievable. I know you do it.
That's not even my day job, by the way.
No, I know. I'm doing a Substack on the school shootings based on the last two shows we did. And I just kind of, at 2:00 in the afternoon, I just bogged down. I have to put it away for the day and come back to it. But we'll get there. Anyway, thanks so much, Jeffrey. I'm so grateful as usual. I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing. And I'm glad you came on the podcast again. Thanks so much.
Okay. All the best to you. Bye-bye.
So that was the great Jeffrey Tucker, who is the founder of the Brownstone Institute, and it's a website you should go to. I go there almost daily because they're cranking out a lot of really interesting writing and thinking about COVID-19. And he was also the person who facilitated the Great Barrington Declaration and put into the main the idea that focused protection was a much better way to go than lockdowns. So he was right about that. He's a very, very smart and nice guy. He also wrote a book called Liberty or Lockdown, which, if you're so inclined, you could purchase on Amazon. And he'll be back. I want to follow this new initiative of his of how to hold these people accountable. Good luck. I'm not optimistic, but hey, you never know. So I'm just going to kind of do a quick little mop up here. The first thing I want to say after the Sussman trial, which ended yesterday, today is Wednesday, and this drops on Friday. So it will be like 3 days ago, probably when you hear this. But Sussman was the Russia hoax lawyer who was being tried by a prosecutor named Durham. Absolutely rock solid evidence against him, but there was a democratically, I think an Obama-appointed judge, and a whole bunch of people on the jury were Hillary supporters and Hillary donors, and somebody on the jury actually hung around with the judge's kid, or Sussman's kid. I think it's just like Venezuela. I mean, regardless of where you sit politically, you have to lament the fall of the American judicial system into tribalism and politics, right? We know that Hillary Clinton framed Donald Trump, and no one will ever go to prison for it. No one will. It's true. We know that now. Some people are more kind of optimistic about it. Many legal scholars have written that what happened at that trial under oath exposed some new information, but I'm not holding my breath. It's, as I say frequently on the show, I think America is either a failing or failed state, right? And we had on the show a couple of shows ago, Colonel Douglas McGregor, who I am a major fan of. He's been speaking out very, very smartly about Ukraine. And hardly anybody is, especially hardly anybody in the military. But he said on our show, we kind of did like a lightning round, and I said, who's winning? And he said, Russia's winning, and Russia will win. And Russia, based on everything we're seeing this week, is winning. It's winning the eastern Donbass and then down. It's winning that. And the legacy media can pump out as much propaganda as they want. That Ukraine is winning. Ukraine is not winning. Russia's winning, and they will win. And the sad part of that, because I know many, many people support the Ukrainian people, is that this was the inevitable result. It shouldn't have gone on this long. Zelensky should not have been encouraged in his macho stance to take on Russia. It's lunacy for him to do that, and it's lunacy for the West to support him and keep the carnage going. So if you didn't hear Douglas McGregor on my show, please go back a couple of episodes. If you go to Apple, you can scroll through and look where it is. Listen to it. He was right. He's right about most things on Ukraine and Russia. So I'm going to dedicate this episode to my own two brave boys, one who's graduating and the one who's flying out at the last minute to see him because mommy can't go. I'm proud of them both, and I wish I could be there. And this show will drop, I think, right on the day of the graduation ceremony, so I'll make them listen to it and hope they understand how much they mean to me. I'm very grateful for them today. But I'm not grateful for my government and not my fellow Canadians who will let their fellow Canadians be punished because we weren't obedient enough for Justin Trudeau, even though there's no scientific evidence for it. It's shocking that we have no recourse. That where are the lawsuits on our behalf? It's so frustrating, so frustrating. But I'll quit bitching about it and just say, I'm proud of my kids, and I'm happy to know people like Jeffrey Tucker who've been fighting the good fight with facts and really sophisticated analysis almost from the beginning. So, and I will say this to people listening who don't get why someone who's unvaccinated is so angry. The tyranny that is keeping me from boarding a plane this week will come for us all, including you. So you should be siding with me instead of telling me tough luck, which I'm sure many people do say to unvaccinated people who are facing restrictions. Anyway, I just want to say my final two things, and that is stay critical, and we'll see you.